The autumn wind carried the scent of dying grass across the Montana plains as Samuel Hartwell stood on his cabin porch, surveying the remnants of what had once been a promising wheat harvest. Locusts had swept through the territory like a biblical plague, leaving behind fields of stubble and the bitter taste of broken dreams. His weathered hands gripped the porch railing as he calculated, for the 100th time, how long his remaining supplies might last through the coming winter. Samuel was a man of 53 years, his face carved by decades of prairie sun and disappointment. He'd come west after losing his farm in Ohio to debt collectors, believing the frontier promised a fresh start for those willing to work hard. His wife Martha had shared that dream until consumption took her 3 winters ago, leaving Samuel alone with their memories and a determination to make something of the land she'd loved. The sound of creaking wagon wheels interrupted his melancholy thoughts. A dust cloud on the eastern horizon marked the approach of travelers, unusual for this remote corner of the territory. Samuel squinted against the afternoon glare, making out the outline of a heavily loaded wagon pulled by 2 exhausted oxen. As the wagon drew closer, he could see that its occupants were in desperate condition. The driver was a gaunt man with hollow cheeks and clothes that hung loose on his skeletal frame. Beside him sat a woman clutching a bundle that could only be an infant, her face pale with exhaustion and worry. 3 children huddled in the wagon bed, their eyes too large and faces marked by hunger and hardship. Samuel had seen that look before during the war, the expression of people who had reached the very edge of survival. The wagon lurched to a halt in front of Samuel's cabin, and the driver struggled to dismount. He stumbled slightly, catching himself against the wagon wheel with hands that trembled from weakness. When he spoke, his voice was hoarse with thirst and desperation. "Mister, we've been traveling for 6 days without proper food. My wife's milk has dried up, and our baby." His voice broke, and he couldn't continue. The woman in the wagon began to weep quietly, rocking the bundle in her arms. Samuel didn't hesitate. "Get them inside. Martha's old rocking chair is still by the fire. I'll see to the oxen." He was already moving toward the wagon, his own troubles forgotten in the face of immediate human need. The family's name was Donnelly, Patrick and Mary, with children ages 8, 6, 4, and the baby who couldn't be more than 3 months old. They'd been heading to Oregon Territory when illness struck their livestock and they'd lost most of their supplies to river crossings and trail breakdowns. Patrick had sold their remaining possessions in the last town just to buy grain for the oxen, leaving them with nothing but hope and determination. As Samuel heated soup and prepared what food he could spare, he listened to their story with growing concern. Winter was approaching fast, and the nearest town was 40 miles through increasingly treacherous terrain. The family was in no condition to travel further, and their oxen were near collapse. That first night, Samuel gave up his own bed to Patrick and Mary, while he and the children slept on pallets by the fire. He'd made a pot of thin but nourishing soup from his precious stores of beans and salt pork, and for the first time in days, the Donnelly family went to sleep with food in their bellies. Baby Michael, as Samuel learned the infant was named, had stopped crying once Mary was able to nurse him again, her body responding to proper nutrition with the resilience of youth. Samuel lay awake long into the night, calculating and recalculating his supplies. Before the Donnellys' arrival, he'd estimated his food would last until spring if he was careful. Feeding 6 additional people, even for a short time, would put a severe strain on his stores. But he'd watched Martha waste away from sickness, had held her hand as she made him promise to always help those in need. "Kindness is the only thing that multiplies when you give it away," she'd whispered in her final days. The next morning brought the first hard frost of the season, and Samuel knew the family couldn't continue their journey. The children were still weak, and Mary was in no condition to travel with a nursing infant. Patrick tried to argue, insisting they couldn't impose further on Samuel's hospitality, but the rancher wouldn't hear of it. "This cabin's seen empty rooms for 3 years," Samuel said firmly. "A house needs children's laughter to keep the loneliness away. You'll stay until spring, and that's the end of it." As the days passed, the Donnelly family slowly regained their strength. Samuel watched 8-year-old Timothy's eyes brighten as proper meals filled out his gaunt cheeks, saw little Sarah laugh as she chased chickens around the yard, observed how 6-year-old James helped with simple chores with the eager enthusiasm of a boy trying to prove his worth. The baby, Michael, grew stronger each day, his cries becoming lusty and demanding rather than weak and plaintive. Patrick proved to be a skilled carpenter, and despite his weakened condition, he insisted on earning his keep. He repaired the cabin's sagging roof, fixed the barn door that had been hanging crooked for 2 years, and crafted a beautiful cradle for baby Michael from scraps of wood Samuel had been saving. His wife Mary was equally industrious, mending Samuel's clothes with neat, careful stitches, and organizing his chaotic kitchen with the efficiency of a woman accustomed to making do with little. But Samuel could see his food supplies dwindling faster than snow in spring sunshine. He began eating smaller portions, claiming he wasn't as hungry as he used to be, making sure the children had enough before serving himself. Patrick noticed his host's sacrifice and confronted him privately one evening as they checked on the livestock. "You're giving us your food," Patrick said bluntly. "Don't deny it. I've watched you push more food toward the children and take less for yourself. This isn't sustainable, Samuel. We need to find another solution." Samuel looked out over his frost-covered fields, avoiding Patrick's penetrating gaze. "I've lived through lean times before. I'll manage. And if you don't," Patrick pressed, "what happens to all of us then? You're a good man, Samuel Hartwell, but martyrdom won't save my children if you starve yourself to death." The conversation with Patrick haunted Samuel through the following days. The Irishman was right. Samuel's noble intentions wouldn't help anyone if he collapsed from malnutrition. But what alternative did he have? The nearest town was too far to reach regularly for supplies, even if he had money to buy them, which he didn't. His small herd of cattle was his only real asset, and he'd need every head to survive the winter and rebuild in the spring. The first real blizzard hit on a Tuesday in November, howling across the plains with the fury of a living thing. Samuel had lived through enough Montana winters to recognize this as a serious storm, the kind that could last for days and pile snow so deep that travel became impossible. He'd prepared as well as he could, moving the livestock to the reinforced barn and stockpiling firewood near the cabin. But feeding 8 people through a storm like this would strain his resources to the breaking point. As wind rattled the cabin's shutters and snow piled against the windows, the Donnelly family huddled around the fire while Samuel tried to maintain an optimistic demeanor. He told stories of previous winters, made jokes about the storm's ferocity, and played simple games with the children to keep their spirits up. But privately, he was calculating how many days the storm might last, and whether his remaining food could stretch that far. On the second day of the blizzard, baby Michael developed a fever. Mary was beside herself with worry, pacing the small cabin while the infant cried weakly in her arms. Samuel had no medicine to offer except willow bark tea and the warmth of the fire, but he could see the fear in both parents' eyes. They'd already lost one child during their journey west, a little girl who'd succumbed to fever just outside Kansas territory. The memory of that loss haunted them like a ghost. Patrick worked alongside Samuel to keep the fire going and the cabin warm, but Samuel noticed the Irishman was growing increasingly agitated. During a brief lull in the storm, Patrick pulled on his coat and announced his intention to venture outside. "Where are you going in this weather?" Samuel demanded, grabbing Patrick's arm. "To find help," Patrick replied grimly. "My boy is sick, and we're eating you out of house and home. There has to be someone else in this godforsaken territory. Some neighbor who might have supplies or medicine." "Don't be a fool," Samuel said sharply. "You'll die in this storm, and then, where will your family be? We'll manage somehow. We have to." But even as he spoke the words, Samuel wondered if they were true. His own strength was failing from reduced rations, and the constant worry was wearing him down. Mary's milk was beginning to fail again as her own nutrition suffered, and baby Michael's condition seemed to be worsening. The other children, though they tried to hide it, were clearly hungry despite Samuel's best efforts to keep them fed. That night, as the family slept fitfully around the dying fire, Samuel knelt by the window and prayed with a desperation he hadn't felt since Martha's final illness. He wasn't a particularly religious man, but the vastness of the prairie and the immediacy of their need drove him to his knees in supplication. "I don't ask for much," he whispered to the howling wind. "Just help me keep these children alive. If I'm to lose everything, let it be after they're safe. Don't let my failure be their death sentence." The storm raged for 3 more days. On the 6th morning, the wind finally died to a whisper, and Samuel opened the cabin door to find a world transformed by snow. Drifts reached nearly to the eaves in places, and the familiar landmarks of his property had disappeared under a blanket of pristine white. The silence was profound after days of howling wind, broken only by the distant lowing of his cattle and the creak of snow-laden tree branches. Baby Michael's fever had broken during the night, much to everyone's relief, but the crisis had taken its toll on the entire family. Mary was hollow-eyed with exhaustion, Patrick moved with the careful deliberation of a man conserving his strength, and even the older children seemed subdued by their ordeal. Samuel knew they needed proper food soon, or the next crisis might have a different outcome. He was contemplating which of his cattle he might sacrifice for meat when he heard an impossible sound, the jingle of harness and the snort of horses approaching through the snow. Samuel stepped onto his porch, shading his eyes against the glare, and saw what looked like a mirage shimmering in the white landscape. A train of pack horses was winding its way through the drifts toward his cabin, led by riders whose faces were obscured by heavy winter gear. Samuel's hand instinctively moved to his rifle. Travelers in this weather could mean trouble as easily as help, but something about their purposeful approach suggested they weren't random wanderers. The lead rider pulled up in front of the cabin and pushed back his hood, revealing a weathered face with intelligent brown eyes and graying hair. He was clearly a man of mixed heritage, his features suggesting both European and Native American ancestry. When he spoke, his voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to command. "Samuel Hartwell?" the man inquired, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer. "My name is Marcus Whitehorse. We've come a long way to find you." Samuel's mind raced. He'd never heard the name Marcus Whitehorse, and he couldn't imagine how anyone had found his remote cabin in the aftermath of such a storm. "I'm Hartwell," he confirmed cautiously. "But I'm afraid you have me at a disadvantage. I don't know you, and I can't imagine what business brings you here in weather like this." Whitehorse smiled, and his weathered face transformed with genuine warmth. "We're here because of something you did for a family named Peterson about 2 years ago." Ring any bells? Samuel's memory stirred. The Petersons. Yes, he remembered them now. A young couple with twin boys who'd been stranded when their wagon broke down during an early winter storm. He'd taken them in for several weeks while they waited for the weather to clear and managed to get replacement parts from town. They'd been grateful but hardly affluent. Certainly not the type of people who could arrange for mysterious rescue missions. "I remember them," Samuel said slowly. "But they were just passing through heading for California territory. Nice folks. But I can't see how." "James Peterson is my brother-in-law," Whitehorse interrupted. "When he reached California, he wrote to his sister, my wife, about the kindness you showed his family. She's never forgotten that letter, and neither have I. When we heard through the trader networks about the locust swarms in this region, we decided it was time to return a favor." As if summoned by his words, the other riders began unloading the pack horses, revealing an astonishing array of supplies. There were sacks of flour and beans, sides of bacon wrapped in canvas, crates of canned goods, bags of coffee and sugar, and even some bottles of medicine. Samuel watched in stunned amazement as the men efficiently stacked enough food to feed his household through the winter and beyond. Patrick Donnelly appeared at Samuel's shoulder, his eyes wide with disbelief. "Sweet Mary and Joseph," he whispered. "It's like the miracle of the loaves and fishes." Marcus Whitehorse supervised the unloading of supplies with the efficiency of a man accustomed to organizing complex operations. Samuel learned that Whitehorse ran a trading company that connected various frontier communities, Native American tribes, and even some operations in California and Oregon territories. His network of contacts included everyone from mountain men to Methodist missionaries, and news traveled through these connections faster than most people realized. "The Peterson boys are grown men now," Whitehorse explained as his men carried supplies into Samuel's cabin. "They both became successful merchants in Sacramento, and they've never forgotten the man who saved their family during that storm. When I told them about organizing this supply run, they insisted on contributing the bulk of the goods." Samuel was overwhelmed by the generosity, but also troubled by the implications. "This is incredibly kind," he said, "but I can't possibly repay such a debt. I don't have the money for all this, and my prospects for next year's crop are uncertain at best." Whitehorse laughed, a rich sound that seemed to fill the snowy landscape with warmth. "Samuel, you're missing the point entirely. This isn't a business transaction. It's paying forward a kindness. The Petersons didn't ask for repayment when you helped them, did they? They just asked that you continue being the kind of man who helps others in need." As the day progressed, Samuel learned more about the remarkable network that had made this rescue possible. Whitehorse's operation was part business venture and part humanitarian mission, connecting isolated settlements and ensuring that no community faced disaster alone. They'd brought supplies to drought-stricken ranches, delivered medicine to typhoid-afflicted towns, and even helped broker peace between competing settler groups. "The frontier is harsh enough without people fighting each other," Whitehorse observed as they shared a meal that evening. His men had set up camp near the barn, but Samuel had insisted the leader join his family for dinner. Cooperation and mutual aid aren't just nice ideas out here. They're survival strategies. Mary Donnelly, restored by proper nutrition and relief from constant worry, proved to be an excellent cook when she had adequate ingredients to work with. She'd prepared a feast that seemed almost magical after weeks of thin soup and rationed portions. The children's laughter filled the cabin as they enjoyed their first full meal in longer than they cared to remember. During the meal, Whitehorse shared stories of his various adventures and encounters throughout the territory. He spoke of helping establish trade relationships between distant settlements, of mediating disputes between ranchers and native tribes, of organizing relief efforts for communities struck by natural disasters. Samuel began to understand that he was dealing with a man who'd built an entire philosophy of life around the principle of mutual aid. "You know," Whitehorse said thoughtfully as they sipped coffee by the fire, "we could use a man like you in our network. Someone with a good reputation, a strategic location, and a proven track record of helping others. Have you ever considered becoming more than just a rancher?" The suggestion caught Samuel off guard. "What do you mean?" "I mean becoming a way station for our operation. We'd supply you with goods to trade and distribute, help you build proper storage facilities, maybe even establish a small store. You'd still ranch, of course, but you'd also become a hub for travelers and settlers in this region." Patrick Donnelly looked up from his plate with obvious interest. "That sounds like it could work," he said thoughtfully. "This location is isolated enough to be defensible but accessible enough for travelers, and Samuel's already proven he can be trusted with people's lives." Samuel felt overwhelmed by the rapid changes in his circumstances. Just days ago, he'd been facing potential starvation and the loss of everything he'd worked to build. Now he was being offered a chance not just to survive but to prosper while helping others do the same. The next morning brought clear skies and the kind of crystalline air that made the snow-covered landscape sparkle like scattered diamonds. Whitehorse's men were preparing to continue their journey, but not before demonstrating some of the practical aspects of their proposal. They showed Samuel how to properly store bulk goods to prevent spoilage, explained the basics of frontier trading protocols, and outlined the communication system they used to coordinate supply runs across vast distances. Samuel found himself fascinated by the sophistication of their operation. What he'd initially taken for simple generosity was actually part of a complex network designed to make frontier life more sustainable and secure. Whitehorse's traders carried news as well as goods, serving as a communication system that connected isolated communities across hundreds of miles. "The key is trust," Whitehorse explained as they walked around Samuel's property, discussing potential improvements. "Every person in our network knows that they can depend on the others, and that creates a strength greater than any individual community could achieve alone. Your willingness to help the Peterson family, and now the Donnellys, proves you understand that principle instinctively." Patrick had been listening to these conversations with growing excitement. As his health improved with proper nutrition, his natural intelligence and practical skills became increasingly apparent. He approached Samuel privately with a proposal that could benefit everyone involved. "I've been thinking about your situation," Patrick said as they checked on the livestock. "Mary and I don't want to be burdens forever, but we also don't want to leave before we can properly repay your kindness. What if we stayed permanently? I could help you build this trading post operation, and Mary could manage the domestic side of things. The children could grow up here, help with the work, as they get older." The idea had obvious appeal, but Samuel worried about the practical implications. "I appreciate the offer, Patrick, but I can barely feed my own operation. How can I support two families? With the trading post, you wouldn't just be supporting us. We'd be supporting each other," Patrick replied earnestly. "I've got carpentry skills. Mary's excellent with accounts and managing supplies. The older children can help with livestock and basic labor. Together, we could build something neither of our families could manage alone." That afternoon, Whitehorse made his final offer more concrete. His organization would provide an initial stock of trade goods worth several $100s, extend credit for additional supplies as needed, and guarantee to purchase any surplus crops Samuel might produce. In exchange, Samuel would serve as a supply depot and rest stop for travelers in the region, maintain communication with other network members, and continue providing assistance to people in need. "Think of it as formalizing what you're already doing," Whitehorse suggested. "You've already proven you'll help people regardless of compensation. This way, you'll actually be able to do more good while securing your own future." As Samuel considered the proposal, He realized it represented far more than just economic opportunity. For the first time since Martha's death, he was being offered a chance to be part of something larger than his own struggle for survival. The loneliness that had been his constant companion for 3 years could be replaced by purpose and community. That evening, as the family gathered around the fire to discuss their future, Samuel looked around at the faces that had brought life back to his empty cabin. Mary Donnelly was nursing baby Michael while keeping one eye on her other children as they played quietly with wooden toys Patrick had carved. Patrick himself sat whittling another toy, his face no longer gaunt with hunger but thoughtful with planning for tomorrow. The decision, when it came, felt as natural as breathing. "We'll do it," Samuel announced quietly. "Make this place a beacon for travelers and a help to anyone who needs it." The children cheered. Mary smiled through tears of relief, and Patrick clasped Samuel's hand with the firm grip of a true partner. Outside, the snow continued to fall gently, but inside the cabin, the future had never looked brighter. Spring arrived early that year, melting the snow with unseasonable warmth and revealing the ambitious construction project that had occupied Samuel, Patrick, and Whitehorse's crew throughout the winter months. What had once been a simple rancher's cabin was now the hub of an impressive complex that included expanded living quarters, a substantial warehouse, a proper store building, and improved livestock facilities. Patrick's carpentry skills had proven invaluable, but his real talent lay in organization and planning. He designed the layout to maximize efficiency while maintaining security, creating clear sight lines and defensible positions without making the place look like a fortress. Mary had contributed her own expertise in managing supplies and logistics, creating inventory systems that would make even big city merchants envious. The transformation hadn't happened overnight. Through the long winter months, as storms raged across the plains, the extended family had worked together with a harmony that surprised even Samuel. The children had their assigned tasks and performed them with the cheerful efficiency of young people who felt valued and needed. Even baby Michael, now a robust 6-month-old, seemed to thrive in the busy, purposeful atmosphere. Samuel had worried about the financial obligations he was taking on, but Whitehorse's network proved as reliable as promised. Traders arrived with clockwork regularity, bringing goods to stock the store and purchasing supplies that Samuel and Patrick had prepared. The account books that Mary maintained showed a steady profit that would have seemed impossible just months earlier. More importantly, the human traffic through their new trading post brought constant validation of their mission. Travelers arrived hungry and left well-fed. Wagon trains stopped for repairs and supplies, and isolated ranchers discovered they were no longer as alone as they'd feared. Samuel found himself becoming a central figure in a community he'd helped create simply by being willing to help others. The first real test of their new role came in April, when a cavalry unit arrived with disturbing news. A group of desperate settlers had become trapped in a box canyon about 30 miles northeast, surrounded by floodwaters from an unusually heavy spring runoff. The military unit was too small to mount an effective rescue, and the nearest fort was too far away to help before the situation became critical. Lieutenant Morrison, the young officer in command of the patrol, was frustrated and worried. "We found them by accident during a routine patrol," he explained to Samuel. "Maybe 20 people, including women and children. They've got some food left, but if those waters don't recede soon, they're going to be in serious trouble." Samuel exchanged glances with Patrick, reading the same determination in his partner's eyes. "What do you need from us?" Samuel asked without hesitation. The rescue operation that followed showcased the network Whitehorse had spent years building. Within hours of the cavalry's arrival, messages were dispatched to other trading posts and settlements throughout the region. Boats were requisitioned from river communities, rope and tackle were gathered from mining operations, and volunteers began converging on Samuel's trading post from dozens of miles away. Mary organized the logistics with military precision, coordinating supplies and accommodations for the growing crowd of rescuers. Patrick worked with Lieutenant Morrison to plan the actual rescue operation, using his organizational skills to turn a chaotic collection of volunteers into an effective relief force. Samuel found himself at the center of it all, the person everyone turned to for final decisions and coordination. It was a role he'd never sought but seemed naturally suited for, drawing on reserves of leadership ability he'd never known he possessed. The rescue convoy that departed Samuel's trading post 2 days later was an impressive sight. 30 volunteers from a dozen different communities had answered the call, bringing boats, ropes, medical supplies, and enough food to feed the stranded settlers for weeks. Samuel rode at the head of the column with Lieutenant Morrison and Patrick, while Mary remained behind to coordinate communications and prepare for the evacuees' arrival. The flooded canyon was even worse than reports had suggested. Spring runoff had turned a normally dry creek bed into a raging torrent that had cut off the settlers' only escape route. The trapped families had taken refuge on a small rise in the canyon floor, but their position was precarious and growing worse as the water continued to rise. Samuel studied the situation with the calculating eye of a man accustomed to solving practical problems. The main challenge wasn't just getting the people out, it was doing so safely while also evacuating their livestock and essential possessions. These settlers, like the Donnellys before them, had everything they owned invested in their westward journey. "We're going to need multiple trips," Samuel observed, watching the swift current. "And we'll have to work fast. That water's still rising." The rescue operation took place over 3 grueling days. Volunteers worked in shifts, ferrying people and possessions across the flood zone, while others prepared camps and organized supplies. Samuel seemed to be everywhere at once, coordinating the boat crews, making decisions about priorities, and providing the steady leadership that kept the operation running smoothly. On the second day, disaster nearly struck when one of the boats capsized in the swift current. Samuel didn't hesitate. He plunged into the icy water to help rescue the passengers, nearly drowning himself in the process. Patrick pulled him from the river just as his strength was failing, but not before Samuel had helped save a mother and her young daughter from certain death. The incident cemented Samuel's reputation among the rescue volunteers and the grateful settlers. Word of his heroism spread through the network of communities, adding another layer to the legend that was building around the former hermit rancher who'd become a frontier leader. By the time the last of the stranded settlers had been evacuated, Samuel's trading post had become a temporary refugee camp housing nearly 50 people. Mary had organized sleeping arrangements, meal schedules, and even basic medical care with an efficiency that amazed the military officers. The children had adapted to their expanded household with the resilience of youth, treating the crisis as an exciting adventure rather than a catastrophe. Lieutenant Morrison, preparing to return to his fort with his patrol, sought out Samuel for a private conversation. "I've been in the territory for 3 years," the young officer said, "and I've never seen anything like what you've accomplished here. The way you organize that rescue, the way people respond to your leadership, it's remarkable." Samuel felt uncomfortable with the praise. "I just did what needed doing. Anyone would have done the same." "No," Morrison said firmly, "they wouldn't have. What you've built here is special. This trading post, this network of mutual aid, this community of cooperation. The territorial governor needs to hear about this operation. We need more places like this, more people like you." As the evacuated settlers began making plans to continue their journeys or establish new homesteads in the region, Samuel reflected on how dramatically his life had changed. A year ago, he'd been a lonely widower, struggling to survive on an isolated ranch. Now he was at the center of a thriving community that extended across hundreds of miles, trusted by everyone from military officers to traveling preachers to speak with authority and act with wisdom. Summer brought unprecedented prosperity to Samuel's trading post. Word of the flood rescue had spread throughout the territory, and travelers began detouring from established routes just to visit the place they'd heard so much about. Samuel found his store doing steady business, his fields producing excellent crops thanks to Patrick's help and improved irrigation, and his cattle herd growing through strategic trading and careful breeding. But the real measure of their success wasn't financial. It was the steady stream of people who arrived seeking not just supplies but help with problems that had no easy solutions. Samuel had become known as a man who could find answers, who could organize solutions, who could bring people together to solve problems that no individual could handle alone. The Donnelly children had thrived in their new environment. Timothy, now 9, could handle livestock with the skill of a boy twice his age, and showed a natural talent for arithmetic that made him invaluable in the store. Sarah had become Mary's assistant in managing the domestic side of the operation, while James proved to have inherited his father's skill with tools and construction. Baby Michael, now a sturdy toddler, ruled the household with the benevolent tyranny that only the youngest child could achieve. Mary had blossomed in her role as co-manager of the trading post. Her organizational skills and gentle manner made her the natural person for travelers to approach with problems, and she'd developed an unofficial counseling practice that helped resolve everything from family disputes to business disagreements. Samuel often marveled at her ability to find solutions that left everyone feeling heard and respected. Patrick had proven to be the perfect business partner. His practical skills complemented Samuel's natural leadership abilities, and his Irish gift for storytelling made the trading post a popular gathering place for travelers who stayed longer and spent more money because they enjoyed the atmosphere. Together, they'd created something neither could have achieved alone. The real test of their community came in August when a cholera outbreak struck a settlement 40 miles south. The disease was spreading rapidly, overwhelming the local doctor and threatening to become a regional catastrophe. Samuel received the news through his communication network and immediately began organizing a response. This time the operation was even more complex than the flood rescue. Medical supplies had to be gathered from across the territory. Doctors and nurses had to be recruited from distant communities, and a quarantine system had to be established to prevent the disease from spreading further. Samuel found himself coordinating with territorial officials, military commanders, and religious leaders to mount the most comprehensive relief effort the region had ever seen. Mary took charge of organizing the medical volunteers, using her natural empathy and organizational skills to create an efficient field hospital system. Patrick led construction crews in building isolation facilities and improving sanitation in the affected settlement. Samuel served as the central coordinator, making decisions that could affect hundreds of lives and managing resources that represented thousands of dollars in value. The cholera crisis lasted 6 weeks and claimed dozens of lives despite their best efforts. But it also demonstrated the power of organized cooperation on a scale that impressed even skeptical territorial officials. Governor William Patterson himself traveled from the territorial capital to observe the relief efforts and meet with the man who'd organized them. "Mr. Hartwell," the governor said during their meeting, "I've received reports about your activities from military officers, territorial judges, and federal marshals. Everyone seems to agree that you've accomplished something remarkable here. I'm wondering if you'd consider a more official role in territorial administration." Samuel was flattered but wary. "What kind of role?" "Territorial liaison for frontier development. You'd help coordinate relief efforts, facilitate communication between isolated settlements, and assist with planning for future expansion. The salary would be substantial, and you'd have significant authority to implement policies that could benefit the entire region." The offer was tempting, but Samuel had learned to value what he'd built too much to risk it for political advancement. "Governor, I appreciate the offer, but I think I can do more good right here. This trading post has become something bigger than I ever imagined, and I'm not willing to abandon it for a desk job in the territorial capital." Patterson nodded with obvious approval. "That's exactly the answer I was hoping for. A man who can't be bought by political ambition is exactly the kind of person we need in positions of responsibility." As autumn returned to the Montana plains, Samuel stood once again on his porch surveying his domain. But the view had changed dramatically from the desolate scene that had greeted him a year earlier. The trading post bustled with activity as travelers prepared for winter journeys. Local ranchers brought in their final harvests for storage and trade, and his extended family worked with the efficient harmony of people who'd found their purpose in life. The original cabin had been expanded into a comfortable home that housed not just Samuel and the Donnellys, but also a rotating cast of temporary residents, travelers waiting for weather to clear, settlers seeking advice about homestead locations, business partners negotiating deals, and even the occasional government official seeking Samuel's counsel on territorial affairs. Samuel had received another visitor that morning, Marcus Whitehorse, making his annual circuit of the trading network he'd helped create. The two men had become close friends and business partners, united by their shared vision of frontier communities that supported each other rather than competed for scarce resources. "You've exceeded every expectation I had when I first proposed this venture," Whitehorse observed as they walked through the expanded complex. "This place has become the hub I hoped for, but more than that, it's become a symbol of what's possible when good people work together." Samuel appreciated the praise, but he was more interested in discussing future plans. The success of their relief operations had convinced him that they needed to expand their network even further, establishing more trading posts at strategic locations throughout the territory. He'd identified several potential partners, people who'd proven their reliability during various crises, who might be willing to establish similar operations. "The key is finding the right people," Samuel explained as they examined maps in his office. "It's not enough to have good business sense or even good intentions. You need people who instinctively understand that helping others ultimately helps yourself. People who can see beyond their immediate circumstances to the larger community." That evening, As the family gathered for their traditional Sunday dinner, Samuel looked around the table at the faces that had become so dear to him. Patrick was discussing plans for expanding the livestock operation, while Mary reviewed the week's accounts and made notes about needed supplies. The children chattered about their various activities and accomplishments, their voices filling the house with the warmth of belonging. Baby Michael, now walking and beginning to talk, toddled over to Samuel's chair and raised his arms to be picked up. As Samuel lifted the boy onto his lap, he was struck by the profound changes a single act of kindness had set in motion. Feeding a starving family had led to partnership, prosperity, and purpose beyond anything he could have imagined. "Uncle Samuel," little Sarah asked suddenly, using the title all the children had adopted for him, "why did you help us when we were hungry? Mama says most people would have sent us away." Samuel considered the question carefully, aware that his answer would help shape the child's understanding of how the world could work. "Because that's what neighbors do for each other," he said finally, "and anyone who needs help is your neighbor, no matter where they come from or what they look like." Timothy, the eldest, nodded seriously. "Like the Peterson family helped bring us all those supplies, and like we helped with the flood and the sickness." "Exactly," Samuel confirmed. "When you help someone, you're not just solving their problem, you're making the whole world a little bit better. And someday, when you need help, there will be people ready to help you because someone else showed them kindness once upon a time." The conversation continued around the dinner table, but Samuel's mind drifted to the letter he'd received that week from the Peterson twins in California. Now successful merchants in their own right, James and John Peterson had written to thank him once again for the kindness he'd shown their family years earlier. But more than gratitude, their letter contained a proposal that could expand the trading network all the way to the Pacific coast. As the evening wound down and the children were tucked into their beds, Samuel stepped outside to enjoy the crisp autumn air. The stars were brilliant in the clear mountain sky, and the sounds of his prosperous operation, cattle lowing in the distance, the creak of well-maintained buildings, the murmur of voices from the guest quarters, created a symphony of contentment. Patrick joined him on the porch, carrying 2 cups of coffee and settling into the chair that had become his customary spot for their evening conversations. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, 2 men who'd found brotherhood in shared purpose and mutual respect. "Do you ever regret it?" Patrick asked eventually. "Taking us in that night, I mean. Your life was simpler then, quieter, some might say more peaceful." Samuel considered the question as he sipped his coffee. "I think about Martha sometimes," he said finally. "Wonder what she'd make of all this chaos and activity. But then I remember what she always said about kindness multiplying when you give it away, and I think she'd be proud of what we've built here." "She'd be amazed," Patrick agreed. "One act of charity has grown into something that touches hundreds of lives across the territory. That's quite a legacy." As if summoned by their conversation, Mary appeared in the doorway with baby Michael in her arms. The boy had been fussy and unable to sleep, but he settled immediately when he saw Samuel. Mary handed him to Samuel with a grateful smile and settled into her own chair to enjoy the peaceful evening. "Marcus left some interesting papers for you to review," she said, producing a folder from her apron. "Proposals for 3 new trading posts, letters from territorial officials requesting your advice on frontier policy, and an invitation to address the territorial legislature about sustainable development strategies." Samuel shook his head in wonder. 3 years ago I was a failed farmer eating beans and hardtack for supper. Now politicians want my advice on government policy. Life certainly takes unexpected turns. The important thing, Mary observed wisely, is that you haven't let success change who you are fundamentally. You're still the man who opens his door to strangers and shares his last meal with hungry children. That's why people trust you, why this whole network functions, because they know your word is good and your heart is in the right place. As autumn deepened toward winter, Samuel reflected on the profound truth of Mary's words. The trading post continued to thrive, but its success was built on something more valuable than profit margins or inventory management. It was built on trust. The trust of travelers who knew they could find honest dealing and fair prices. The trust of communities that knew Samuel would respond to crisis with immediate action. The trust of partners who knew their interests would be protected, even when Samuel wasn't watching. The network that had grown around Samuel's trading post now stretched from the Missouri River to the Pacific Ocean, connecting dozens of communities through bonds of mutual aid and shared prosperity. When drought struck the eastern territories, western communities sent supplies. When disease threatened mountain settlements, Plains communities provided medical assistance. When conflicts arose between different groups, Samuel's trading posts served as neutral ground where differences could be discussed and resolved. Lieutenant Morrison, now promoted to captain, stopped by the trading post on his final patrol before being transferred to a post in Arizona Territory. He'd become a regular visitor over the years, and Samuel valued his friendship and military perspective on frontier affairs. "You know," Morrison said as they shared a drink in Samuel's office, "I've served at posts throughout the West, and I've never seen anything quite like what you've accomplished here. Most frontier communities are isolated, suspicious, constantly fighting for scarce resources. But you've created something different, a community that extends across hundreds of miles, bound together by mutual support rather than competition." Samuel accepted the compliment graciously, but he knew the credit belonged to everyone who'd chosen cooperation over conflict. "I just provided a place where it could happen," he said modestly. "The people who make it work are the ones who deserve the real credit." As winter settled over the Montana plains once more, Samuel's trading post prepared for the season with the confidence of an established operation. The warehouses were full of supplies, the livestock were healthy and well-sheltered, and the extended family was ready for whatever challenges the season might bring. On Christmas Eve, as snow fell softly outside and the great room filled with the warmth of a crackling fire, Samuel looked around at the gathered faces with deep contentment. The Donnelly children were performing a nativity play they'd rehearsed for weeks, their voices clear and sweet as they sang familiar carols. Mary and Patrick watched with the proud eyes of parents, while Marcus Whitehorse and several other guests smiled at the innocent perfection of the performance. The simple act of feeding a hungry family had indeed multiplied beyond anything Samuel could have imagined. But as he watched little Michael toddle across the floor with his arms outstretched, calling Papa Sam in his clear baby voice, Samuel understood that the greatest reward wasn't the prosperity or recognition, or even the satisfaction of building something important. The greatest reward was belonging to a family that had chosen each other, to a community that extended beyond blood relations, to a purpose that gave meaning to every day's work. He'd learned that kindness wasn't just about helping others, it was about creating the connections that made life worth living. As the children finished their performance, and the adults began preparing for the Christmas feast that would feed not just the family but every traveler who happened to be passing through, Samuel offered a silent prayer of gratitude. He'd lost one family to death and sorrow, but kindness had given him another, larger, more diverse, and bound together by choice rather than obligation. Outside, the wind carried whispers of snow across the plains, but inside Samuel's trading post, the warmth of human connection kept all darkness at bay. The rancher who'd once faced starvation and isolation had become the center of a community that proved every day that helping others was the surest path to helping yourself. The story of Samuel Hartwell and the Donnelly family became legend throughout the territory, passed down through generations as proof that simple acts of kindness could change the course of history. It was told around campfires and in settlement halls, adapted into songs and school lessons, remembered whenever people faced the choice between selfishness and generosity. And in the quiet moments before sleep, when the trading post settled into peaceful silence and Samuel counted his many blessings, he could almost hear Martha's voice whispering approvingly, "Kindness is the only thing that multiplies when you give it away." She'd been right, as she so often was. The kindness he'd shared had indeed multiplied, creating a legacy that would outlast any individual life and continue blessing generations yet to come.